The air in Dr. Aris Thorne's lab was thick, a cloying mix of ozone, burned synthetics, and something acridly organic that made my sinuses ache. I pulled my respirator tighter, the dull thrum of the filtration unit a constant companion to the crunch of shattered glass under my sterile boot covers. The scene was a masterclass in devastation, a controlled explosion that had ripped through the heart of what was once a gleaming, high-security research facility. "Looks like a complete write-off, Reed," the lead detective's voice crackled through my comms unit. He stood at the perimeter, arms crossed, his gaze sweeping over the wreckage with an air of practiced weariness. Forensics initially calling it an accidental rupture of the bioreactor. High-pressure system, volatile compounds. Could be a tragic miscalculation, or... Well, you know Thorne's history. Reclusive genius, pushing boundaries. Some are even whispering self-inflicted. I nodded, though the detective couldn't see it behind my mask. Thorne. A name synonymous with pioneering, potentially world-changing bioengineering. His work was often shrouded in a veil of corporate secrecy, intellectual property fiercely guarded. Now, the veil was shredded, replaced by a pall of smoke and the stark reality of his demise. Dr. Thorne's body had already been carefully removed, a charred silhouette on the scorched floor where his main workstation had been. I'd seen the preliminary photos. The damage was extensive, consistent with a rapid, intense thermal event. But consistency was a word I rarely trusted without rigorous verification. My job wasn't to accept narratives, it was to dismantle them, piece by painstaking piece, until the truth, however inconvenient, revealed itself. I moved deeper into the lab, my gloved hands clasped behind my back, eyes scanning every surface, every displaced object. The lab was an advanced facility, designed with multiple containment protocols. Yet, the blast had bypassed them all, or so it seemed. Steel-reinforced doors were buckled inward, heavy equipment toppled like toys. My gaze drifted to a series of sophisticated filtration units lining a section of the far wall. They were heavily damaged, their complex internal mechanisms exposed, but unlike the immediate vicinity of the explosion, they hadn't suffered the same direct, blistering heat. Instead, I noticed a peculiar pattern on their outer casings. Not the radial scorch marks one would expect from a single, outward-spreading blast wave. These were elongated, almost striped, as if something had swept across them, leaving a distinct, linear burn. I knelt, pulling a small, high-magnification lens from my utility belt. The material was a high-grade polymer, designed to withstand extreme temperatures. Yet, here was evidence of localized, intense heat application. The burn pattern itself was subtle, a discoloration rather than outright melting, but it was precise, almost surgical. It didn't fit the chaotic signature of a bioreactor rupture. An accident would be indiscriminate, this felt. Selective. My breath hitched slightly as I brought the lens closer, focusing on the very edge of one of the linear burns. Embedded just beneath the surface, almost imperceptible to the naked eye, was a microscopic speck. It was metallic, a glint of silver against the darkened polymer. Too small to identify without proper analysis, but its presence was entirely anomalous. If this was a catastrophic accident, an explosion of volatile compounds, why would a tiny, metallic fragment be pressed into a specific burn mark, away from the central blast zone, and in such a distinct linear pattern? The implications settled over me like the dust motes dancing in the weak overhead lights. This wasn't just debris from the explosion. This was something else. A residue, perhaps, from a tool or a delivery mechanism. My mind immediately began to spin through the possibilities, each one diverging further from the initial assessment of an accident or suicide. The detective's voice chimed in again. "Anything, Reed? And a trace element I need to identify. This isn't just a random explosion." I stood, my eyes sweeping the scene again, seeing it with fresh, suspicious eyes. Every piece of residue, every fragment of metal, needs to be meticulously collected, catalogued, and brought back to the police department basement holding forensic samples. And I mean every piece. The detective grunted, but I knew he understood the unspoken command in my voice. He'd worked with me enough times to know when I latched onto a detail, it usually meant the official narrative was about to unravel. Aris Thorne had not merely perished in a lab accident. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure it looked that way. And I had just found the first thread to pull. The sterile chill of the examination chamber bit into my skin, a stark contrast to the lingering heat and acrid smell of Thorne's lab. Overhead fluorescence hummed, casting a stark, shadowless light on the steel table where Aris Thorne lay. The forensic pathologist, a woman with keen eyes and an air of quiet efficiency, moved with practiced grace around the body. I watched her, my hands tucked into my pockets, the smell of antiseptic and something faintly metallic filling my nostrils. "Preliminary findings are complex, Reed," he stated, his voice low and even, without looking up from his work. She pointed with a gloved finger to a section of Thorne's torso. The blast itself, as you observed, was significant. Extensive thermal damage, concussive trauma. Consistent with a localized, high-energy event. I nodded, my gaze fixed on the burn patterns. They were deep, but also oddly specific. But not uniform, I mused aloud. The patterns on his clothes, and what little skin remained, suggest an initial flashpoint that didn't quite match the eventual explosion's epicenter. More like an external ignition, rather than a catastrophic internal failure of the equipment directly adjacent to him. The pathologist paused, straightening up. Her eyes met mine across the table. Precisely. There are also indications of bruising on the wrists and ankles, subtle, but present beneath the thermal damage. Predominantly on the anterior surfaces. Consistent with some form of restraint. My gut clenched. Restraint. That confirmed my initial suspicion. Thorne hadn't just been caught in an accident. He'd been held there. Meaning he was incapacitated, or at least immobilized, before the main event. The toxicology report is still pending, she continued, but preliminary screens show no obvious sedatives or paralytics in his system. Not enough to render him completely unresponsive, at least. The trauma from the blast itself would mask any minor struggles. I walked around the table, examining the body from a different angle. The meticulous nature of the pathologist's work was evident in the careful tagging of samples, the precise measurements. My eyes scanned every inch, looking for the anomaly, the piece that didn't fit. The lab had been a pristine environment, almost obsessively so. Yet, something glinted faintly near the collarbone, almost indistinguishable from the ash and debris adhering to the skin. I leaned closer, my breath held. "What's this?" I asked, pointing with a gloved finger. It was a minuscule shard, no larger than a grain of sand, embedded in the singed fabric of his undershirt. It wasn't metal from the lab equipment, It had a distinct, almost iridescent sheen, unlike anything I'd seen in Thorne's facility. The pathologist carefully extracted it with tweezers, placing it on a slide. "Good catch, Reed. It's certainly not standard bioengineering lab material. Appears to be an alloy, but one I don't immediately recognize. We'll send it for spectral analysis." I felt a surge of grim satisfaction. This was it. The non-lab related trace element. A calling card, or perhaps just a stray piece of evidence, but it was external. Hours later, the details of the preliminary autopsy report still echoed in my mind as I sat across from the rival scientist in one of the police department's sterile interview rooms. The air was thick with unspoken tension. The rival scientist, a man named Vance, looked impeccably dressed, even under the circumstances, his expensive suit uncreased, his silver hair perfectly coiffed. He projected an aura of detached academic superiority, a common trait among Thorne's professional peers. "A tragic loss, of course," Vance began, his tone carefully neutral, though I detected a faint tremor in his voice. Aris was driven. Brilliant, certainly. But his methods were often unconventional. And his competitive streak, well, it was legendary. "You two had a history of professional disagreements, I understand," I stated, watching his eyes. They flickered, just for a moment. "Academic rivalries are common, investigator," he replied, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Healthy, even. They pushed the boundaries of discovery. Aris and I often found ourselves vying for the same grants, the same recognition. His groundbreaking work, particularly in the field of cellular regeneration, often overshadowed mine. He had a knack for dramatic reveals, for capturing the spotlight. And sometimes, I felt, for claiming credit for nascent ideas that were, shall we say, in the shared intellectual ether. He paused, adjusting his tie. "But to suggest animosity? No. Frustration, perhaps, at his secrecy. He became increasingly insular in recent months, even for Aris. His final project, whatever it was, he guarded it like a dragon with its hoard. A lot of us in the field suspected he was close to something truly revolutionary, or perhaps dangerously unstable." The interview with the former research assistant, a woman named Maya, was a stark contrast. She sat hunched, her hands clasped tightly, her eyes red-rimmed. She'd worked with Thorne for 5 years before abruptly leaving his team 6 months ago. "He was a genius, yes," she said, her voice raspy, "but he was also a tyrant. He pushed us mercilessly. Demanded absolute loyalty. And if you questioned him, even once, you were out. He took all the credit, always. I poured my life into that lab, into his research, and when I presented an alternative methodology for a critical phase of the project, he dismissed it. Publicly. Humiliated me. Then he cut me out of the project entirely, claiming my contributions were no longer aligned with his vision." Her knuckles were white. "I left, Reed. I had no choice. My career was being stifled. He was paranoid, obsessed with secrecy. He thought everyone was trying to steal his work. He even accused me once of leaking data, which was a complete fabrication. He made my life a living hell. Do you know anything about his final project?" I asked, leaning forward slightly. She shook her head. No, not directly. After I left, he tightened security even further. Something about accelerated cellular growth, beyond anything previously imagined. Something that could change everything, for better or worse. He was desperate to finish it, to prove everyone wrong, especially the ones who doubted his methods. Leaving the interview rooms, I walked down the echoing corridor. Vance had motive born of professional jealousy and a history of being outshone. Maya had motive stemming from humiliation and a sense of betrayal. But the small, iridescent shard from Thorne's collarbone nagged at me. It felt like the key. The pathologist had called me an hour ago. The spectral analysis was in. The trace element was an alloy of rare earth metals, typically used in high-end, specialized electronics, not common in any commercial product, and certainly not something found in Thorne's bioengineering lab. It pointed to a bespoke, almost artisanal source. Someone who knew what they were doing, someone with access to highly specialized components. Someone who had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide their tracks, only to leave behind a single, almost invisible, glimmering clue. The official narrative had already begun to crumble. Now, it was clear, this wasn't just a murder, it was a carefully orchestrated execution, and the killer was far more sophisticated than I had initially imagined. That shard was a thread, and I intended to pull on it until the entire tapestry of deception unraveled. The tension in my gut tightened. This was just the beginning. The echoes of the corridor faded, leaving me with the lingering impressions of Vance's bitterness and Maya's quiet resentment. Both had reason to wish Thorne gone, and both possessed an intimate understanding of the lab's intricate defenses, or at least enough to navigate its complexities. But the microscopic trace, the unusual burn pattern, they whispered of something more precise, more deliberate than a mere outburst of jealousy or anger. My next step was clear. I needed to see what Thorne had been working on, to peer into the mind of the man himself through the digital window of his research. The air was cool, dry, and smelled faintly of ozone and sterile wipes. Rows of sealed evidence lockers lined the concrete walls, each holding a fragment of some shattered life. The lead forensic analyst, a focused individual with quick, precise movements, was already immersed in Thorne's primary research server. The screen glowed with intricate diagrams and sequences, a language of life rendered in code. "Anything interesting yet?" I asked, pulling up a chair beside the workstation. The analyst didn't look up, eyes glued to the display. He was deep into genetic sequencing, read. Not just identification, but manipulation. Designing, essentially. The scope. It's breathtaking. Imagine correcting genetic predispositions to disease, or, on the flip side, engineering vulnerabilities. The words hung heavy in the chilled air, the dual potential of Thorne's work starkly apparent. Global health salvation or a new era of bioweaponry. I leaned closer, studying the scrolling data. Has anything been compromised? That's where it gets complicated, the analyst replied, finally turning to me, a flicker of concern in their eyes. We've found evidence of sophisticated data manipulation. Layers of it. Not just a simple deletion. It's like someone tried to rewrite the history of certain project files, then erased the rewrite. My gaze sharpened. An attempted wipe? More than that. It's a ghost in the machine. We're talking about specific project folders related to his Genesis initiative, the core of his work on gene editing for enhanced cellular regeneration. But they weren't thorough enough. Or perhaps they were interrupted. The analyst gestured to a series of timestamps. It happened in the hours immediately following Thorne's death. Also, surprisingly, in the days leading up to it. So, an external party had access. Thorne himself was trying to hide something, I mused, the pieces beginning to shift into a new, unsettling configuration. The sophistication of the attempt. It speaks to someone who understood his systems intimately. Not a panicked amateur. If Thorne was hiding something, what was it? The burn pattern, the microscopic trace, they suddenly felt less like evidence of a struggle and more like remnants of a desperate cover-up. My mind immediately went to Maya. Her quiet demeanor, her evasiveness during the interview, the way she clutched her hands, it all replayed with new meaning. If anyone would know about Thorne's secrets, about who might have had access, it would be his closest assistant. I left the basement, the sterile calm replaced by a growing knot of urgency in my gut. I found Maya in a small interview room, nursing a cup of lukewarm tea. She looked even more withdrawn than before, her eyes distant, her shoulders hunched. "Maya," I began, keeping my voice even, "we need to revisit some things. Specifically, Dr. Thorne's research. Someone tried to erase them, then cover their tracks. Very sophisticated. Do you know anything about that? Did Thorne ever express concerns about someone accessing his work, or did he ever mention trying to hide anything himself?" Maya picked at a loose thread on her sleeve, avoiding my gaze. He was different lately. Paranoid, maybe. Always looking over his shoulder. He'd spend hours in the lab, sometimes not even working, just watching the monitors, checking the security logs. He said he felt like he was being watched, that someone was trying to get at his work. He became obsessed with encryption, with layered defenses. He said he had to protect his research, no matter the cost. Did he ever say who he suspected? I pressed, leaning forward slightly. He said this ghost knew how to move without leaving a trace, how to manipulate things from the inside out. A ghost in the machine. The analyst's words echoed in my mind. The data manipulation wasn't just an external hack, it spoke of someone who knew the system from within. Someone who understood Thorne's digital architecture as well as, or perhaps even better than, Thorne himself. It hinted at a deep, insidious threat that had been lurking in Thorne's world long before his lab exploded. And now, I realized, it was lurking in mine,